Welcome to Framework Fortune. I'm your host Ben, and we're going to be taking a look at the live stream yesterday from the IMF Spring meeting. But this is more going to be a roast rather than a reaction because, well, let's not waste any time. Let's just get into it. So first thing I want to point out is these graphics. For this to be some of the richest people in the world, yeah, hey IMF, holler at me. I'll do some graphics for you. Over there. The debate. Here we go.
Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the IMF's debate on the global economy. I'm Sarah Eisen. I'm the host of Closing Bell on CNBC, and I am thrilled to be here in person at the IMF in Washington with a distinguished
she is from CNBC.
Group of leaders to talk about all of the issues facing the global economy. Joining me is Christine Lagarde. She is the ECB president, managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, the chair of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, and from Indonesia, the Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani Indrawati. And then joining us remotely, we've got the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who couldn't be here today, and she is in sunny Barbados.
So we've got CNBC news anchor, we have the head of the European Central Bank, we have managing director of the IMF, we have old Jerome Powell, our head of Federal Reserve, and then we have leader of Indonesia Central Bank here as well. And then, of course, we have one more guest.
And from Indonesia, the Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani Indrawati. And then joining us remotely, we've got the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who couldn't be here today, and she is in sunny Barbados. We're all jealous, and we're happy to have everyone here.
It does look nice and sunny in Barbados.
The most powerful women in the economy and Chair Powell. Welcome. So we came here.
What? I'm going to run that back so you guys can hear that again.
Everyone here, the most powerful women in the economy and Chair Powell. Welcome. So we came here today and we thought we were.
So coming out straight with a diss, we've got all these women here and then all these great, powerful women. But then we've got Jerome Powell.
We're going to be discussing this year the recovery from a brutal 2 years of COVID. And instead, we've got the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We have that influencing prices and inflation. We have a dramatic shift in policy, and we have some aggressive lockdowns in China. And all of that is distorting and depressing the global economic outlook. So maybe, Madam MD, if you could just kick it off and set the stage for us, because you did cut your outlook for the global economy this year, and it sounds like you're going to be cutting it more. So how much of a slowdown are we facing?
It is quite significant. Last year, we were doing quite well, 6.1% growth. We were projecting...
Now, I want to point out some things here for each person before I start roasting as well. This is a pearl necklace, very expensive. Ring. Nice watch or bracelet. So she's got quite a bit of money on her, and this very nice white jacket.
Slightly less, but still high for this year, nearly 5%. And then we got Omicron, first revision downwards, and the war in Ukraine, second more significant revision downwards. Would there be more? It is to be seen. It depends on how long the war is going to last, how effective policymakers are going to be to deal with inflation without slowing down growth.
Yeah.
And is there something else to hit us? We do live in a more shock-prone world. If anything...
We live in a more shock-prone world, so it's like she's almost predicting something else is going to happen. A little sinister smile.
We learned in these 2 years is that we have to be more agile to build more resilience to these shocks. And one of the objectives of us meeting here in Washington is to talk with each other and identify what is the policy combination that can deal with these short-term challenges without jeopardizing longer-term sustainable growth.
Well, we do have a good mix of
She just laughed at jeopardizing sustainable growth while trying to combat inflation.
Fiscal and monetary leaders here on the panel. So just to follow up quickly, Madam MD, as far as the outlook and the deterioration, how close are we to something like a global recession?
Well, we are still very much in positive territory. Growth projection for this year, as you said, 3.6%. Let's remember that was the average growth rate between 2011 and 2019. We have only small handful of...
Okay, so that may be accurate, but you have to keep in mind from 2011 to 2019, we did not have a big lockdown of everything across the globe during that time. That happened during 2020. All those jobs was lost, all that growth was lost, and so us being at 3.8, whatever she said, percent growth, 3.6 at the moment is not the same 3.6% during that time. Plus, if you're talking about growth, what is she talking about the growth in? Is she talking in US dollars? Is she talking in euros? The IMF, I'm guessing that she's looking at US dollar measurements. Well, 3.6% now is not the same as 3.6% then as well, because inflation is 6.5% higher than it was back then. So she's trying to make it sound like everything's okay, but that is not quite accurate. It is taking the facts and skewing them to kind of fit that narrative, kind of like her teeth skews a little bit.
Countries that are in negative territory. Among them, Ukraine, devastated, shrinking by 40%. Russia, very significantly, in fact, impacted, 11% below what we projected in October. But most of the
well, I wonder why.
Countries are growing, although slowly. What is the big problem, Sarah? The big problem is that the exit from the pandemic-induced crisis is now slowing down for the future. Just one number. Emerging markets and developing economies will be still 6% below their pre-pandemic trend in 2026. This is 2 years or more delay in their recovery. What is my biggest worry?
So most countries in the world right now are below, they're below where they should be. And I believe she said by -6%, whatever the number is. The one number that she pointed out is not a good number. So
with food prices, energy prices up, with prospects for recovery much worse, are we going to see the phenomenon from 2019, people on the street, unrest, creating more difficult environment for policymakers to do the right thing?
Yeah, we're going to get into some of those risks.
But I don't like that. Now listen, you heard that. She said, we are concerned about will there be people in the streets unrest, making it harder for policymakers to do the right thing. Well, if those people are in the street in the first place, maybe the policymakers haven't been making the right decisions and they need to be distracted. But that type of talk right there from somebody in power like this, that sounds like maybe a call for regulations on protesting, which you end protesting completely, then nobody can speak up, everybody gets thrown in jail, and the policymakers get to do what they think is right no matter what. So I don't like the way the IMF head director there is talking.
I do want to hear the individual outlooks, especially from Europe, President Lagarde, because of its proximity to Russia and Ukraine, the spillover effects that you're seeing, and now there are concerns about stagflation there and the effects where it depresses economic growth and drives up prices. So how much has the outlook for Europe changed?
It has changed exactly in the same direction as indicated by
Christina. So where I was pointing to the jury of the IMF head, you can see the European Central Bank leader is rocking. This has got to be over $1 million that she has on her. Look at these diamonds in the earrings, in the necklace, in the watch, in this big ring. Her pin, I guarantee, is not made from anything other than silver, platinum, or some type of gold. She would not be wearing a little fake metal pin with all of this tons of money on that she has. But besides just pointing this out, that this is a very rich person telling you how you should live your life, we got to talk about this scarf. I mean, let's not move forward until we talk about this scarf. This scarf, you got millions of dollars on, and this is probably a very expensive scarf, but she looks like she is about to go to the desert, find a magical lamp, and rub it with this scarf. She, like, what is going on with this thing? And it's really tight too, man. It looks like her head is about to pop off of her little tiny shoulders. I think this is what happens when a central banker goes Super Saiyan Blue. But yes, let's listen to what this very, very rich lady in control of all of Europe with her magical Blue's Clues scarf that looked like a Smurf wiped its ass with. Let's hear what she's got to say.
It's been a haircut to growth projections.
Speaking of haircuts.
And it's been a rise in the inflation numbers. And certainly when we look at the risks, they're skewed to the downside for growth. So there might be more cuts to come, and to the upside for inflation. That's where we are. And it's particularly saddening, inflation numbers. And certainly when we look at the risks, they're skewed to the downside for growth. So there might be more cuts to come, and to the upside for inflation. That's where we are. And it's particularly...
So I ran that back because she just said there's more upside for inflation and more cuts for the central banks to possibly make. So they don't have control of this, obvious. Or they do, and this is a big game to them. I'm trying to figure it out. You know, this panel, we're already only on the second person. We know Jerome Powell's on there, but it's starting to look like the Hunger Games.
Particularly saddening, not only because of the death, not because of the destruction, not because of the devastation, which in and of itself is a cause for huge concern and sympathy and support for the people of Ukraine, and blame for those who took the initiative of that unjustifiable invasion, Russia. But it's also causing harm throughout the world, predominantly in...
Did she forget that it was Russia? The way she said that, sounded like she forgot it was Russia.
Europe for the moment, but it will, there will be ripple effects going way beyond Europe. For the moment, as you said, geography plays a role, and Europe is literally next door. Ukraine is one of us, and taking this horrible hit. We are seeing refugees out of Ukraine into many of our European shores and countries, and we have to, by solidarity, do everything we can to support them. That's the situation that we have at the moment in Europe. It is particularly saddening as well to see that the recovery that we were embarking on is being stalled to a certain degree by what is happening out there.
What if Europe takes another step and does ban Russian oil, gas, and coal? What would happen to the European economy?
Well, let me just first of all salute the sanctions that were decided on a pretty global basis. Sanctions against the oligarchs, sanctions against the family members and the people at the origin of this unjustifiable war. De-swifting of...
Oligarch calling an oligarch an oligarch.
About 80% of the banking sector of Russia, and also freeze of the assets of the National Central Bank of Russia that could be identified outside of Russia and a couple of other countries. So this bulk of, there were 5 set of sanctions decided one after the other, has clearly had a massive impact on Russia. And will continue to have an impact. And I think we will. The more it's rolled out, the more impact it will have. Obviously, the next question that everybody is agitating and
Hold on, before this next question, she is looking like she is trying to hold back laughing about the Russia thing. She looks very pleased with her sanctions and ruining millions of people's lives that had nothing to do with what Putin is doing in his regime, right? There's kids, there's people who work at Russian McDonald's just like people who work in U.S. McDonald's. There's not this whole other magical world where nobody else exists. So seeing her first call the oligarchs as being an oligarch with her fancy diamonds and all of this, and then looking so happy about what they did to Russia. I don't know.
Considering is what happens with the oil on the one hand, the gas on the other hand. I think the issue of coal has been addressed by the Europeans together, who've decided to ban coal coming out of Russia. And
so if you didn't know that, coal is banned coming out of Russia for the European Union.
And I think it's a process, and I would not exclude that there be more decisions to come as it unfolds.
Chair Powell, the U.S. has been a relative bright spot in the global economy, but now policies are changing, as you know, to address inflation, and there are concerns globally about the tightening of monetary policy. What's the U.S. outlook, and how are you feeling right now about your claim that we're not heading toward recession?
Ooh, good question. The CNBC, I think it's CNBC anchor hitting him with a hard question. He normally don't get hit with that type of hard question. Let's see here. I bet it looks like a deer in the headlight.
I guess I'd start by saying that we are unified with our allies around the world in opposition to the invasion of Ukraine for no reason.
Not
and
the question.
Human suffering that's going on there. And while these economic matters are important, there are very fundamental things at stake there that we want to keep in mind. So in terms of the U.S. economy, we are a bit more remote from the immediate effects of the war compared to Europe, for example. But we will be feeling them over time, and they will come in the form of upward pressure on inflation, further upward pressure, and a bit of downward pressure on output. But the U.S. economy is very...
So, he's saying more upward inflation, more downward pressure on the economy, but...
Very strong, performing very well. By most forecasts, we'll have another strong growth year this year. The labor market is extraordinarily tight, extremely tight, historically so, and to the point where really there's an imbalance between supply and demand for workers. And of course, the big issue that we're very focused on is inflation and getting inflation back down to our 2% goal.
But if we start to slow materially in our economy, will you stop tightening even if inflation is still above your target?
Well, so first of all, you asked about a soft landing. Basically that's our goal. Our goal is to get demand, use our tools to get demand and supply back in sync, so that inflation moves down, and do so without a slowdown that amounts to a recession. That's our goal, and I don't think you'll hear anyone at the Fed say that.
Without a slowdown that leads to recession. As I've been saying, if you follow me on the live streams, I think we're already in a recession at the beginning, and everything he's saying is nonsense. However, I love the purple power tie.
That's going to be straightforward or easy. It's going to be very challenging. We're going to do our very best to accomplish.
Wait, this is our head Federal Reserve, and he's got one little wedding ring on and no jewelry whatsoever, and it's like, look at his watch down here. This watch, I just now noticed this, that's like a Kohl's watch. Why does our Federal Reserve guy look broke compared to everybody else? But everything's going good, guys. We're good. We're good over here.
It's absolutely essential to restore price stability. Without price stability, really, the economies don't work without price stability. We need that to have a strong labor market for an extended period of time. We need it for financial stability, so we must do that.
The market has 3 50 basis point hikes coming at the next 3 meetings as of this morning. Is that reasonable?
So I try not to comment on specific market pricing for things, but I will just say this. At our last meeting, and this was in the minutes from the meeting, many on the committee thought it would be appropriate for there to be one or more 50 basis point hikes.
Are you one of those people?
I don't disclose my own path. I try to lead the committee, but so I think markets are processing what we're saying. They're reacting appropriately generally, but I wouldn't want to bless any particular market pricing. The thing I want to say, though.
See, when you are a human being and you have that much power to where you can say, oh, I don't want to bless an entire market. Well, that's not free market. If there's one human being that can bless an entire market because of his policies that he won't even talk about, as he's refusing to. He said, "No, I'm not going to talk about that. I can't say that. I can't say this. You can't say a whole lot of stuff." But
So is we really are committed to using our tools to get 2% inflation back.
what tools?
And I think if you look at, for example, if you look at the last tightening cycle, which was a 2-year string of 25 basis point hikes from 2004 to 2006, inflation was a little over 3%.
Okay, so he's trying to compare back to when inflation was barely over 3% in 2002, 2004. We were nowhere near the amount of debt that we're in. We did not have all these businesses locked down and shut down. Once again, this is what these people like to do. They like to take little bits of fact and try to stroll this whole story of whatever they want the narrative to be. That is not comparable to now. Not even close.
And I think if you look at, for example, if you look at the last tightening cycle, which was a 2-year string of 25 basis point hikes from 2004 to 2006, inflation was a little over 3%. So inflation is much higher now, and our policy rate is still more accommodative than it was then. So it is appropriate, in my view, to be moving a little more quickly. And I also think there's something in the idea of front-end loading whatever accommodation one thinks is appropriate. So that does
close to a
point.
yes.
That points
There
in
you
the
go.
direction of 50 basis points being on the table.
And she called him out. She said, "That's close to a yes." There you go. She's got a little spunk, but obviously, while we've got the screen paused here, notice the obvious color difference in everything. So the background, the floor, the desk, everything is darker colors. They're all wearing darker colors. She does have a white jacket on, but there's white in the background here, white in the background here, white's a neutral color, but she does have that dark as well. And the host has a bright red jacket. She stands out purposely. She is there, and of course she's been leaning forward the whole entire time, guys. I know what you've been watching. Don't you do that. But seriously though, she's been a distraction. She's trying to keep people's focus on the pretty blonde with this big bright red jacket. This is such an obvious marketing advertising ploy scheme to just kind of draw people's eyes and distract them from what these crazy people are actually saying.
Certainly, we make these decisions at the meeting, and we'll make them meeting by meeting, but I would say that 50 basis points will be on the table for the May meeting.
Minister Miliani, are you more worried about what Fed Chair Powell is doing or about what we're seeing in China right now with these aggressive lockdowns because of COVID as it relates to your economy and the region and emerging markets?
Well, United States and China, the two biggest economies in the world. Whatever happened in these two economies definitely have a spillover to the rest of the world. First,
okay, let's do another analysis of what this person is wearing. So we do have a ring. Doesn't look like anything crazy. She does have a digital watch, maybe an Apple Watch. I'm not 100% sure. And then I don't know what this is. I really don't. It looks like she's growing silver out of her heart. Yeah. So she's not got a ton on. Looks like she's got some type of earrings right there that you can barely see. I'm sure there's something nice in there. But again, besides this jewelry, we got to talk about this jacket. Now, I remember when I was a kid, my grandma having a couch that looked exactly like this. So good for her for recycling, couches from the 50s and 40s into a new jacket. That's really commendable.
First, I think what Chairman Powell mentioned about the challenge to stabilize the price inflation down definitely will require monetary tightening, and that has been communicated. We are talking about well-calibrated, well-communicated, well-planned. So even though we cannot afford...
Oh, hold on a second. Look at these purple shoes. Hold on a minute now. She was trying to not to look too fancy, but look at these shoes. These things are purple suede slip-ons, man. Wait, how much are purple suede slip-ons? I want some of those. Those look fancy. Now, I keep pointing this stuff out, this stuff that doesn't seem like a big deal at first glance, because I want to show people these little things to keep in mind about the people who are talking. You know, you hear what they're saying, but look at what they're wearing, look at their body language. At this point here, Jerome Powell is just staring straight ahead. What is he staring at? She's over here looking at this lady. She's looking down, you know, whatever, listening. She's looking over here, but Jerome Powell is just staring straight ahead. What does he see over here? What is he looking at? You know, and that type of body language, staring straight down ahead, that means he's nervous for whatever reason. I mean, he's got a lot of reasons to be nervous, but he is nervous in this room on this panel full of these powerful women. Maybe it's because Jerome Powell has not been around a lot of women in his life. I don't know. Or maybe because, like I said, he's got a whole lot to worry about. But he's showing clear distress right here in this picture on his face. And notice these things as they're talking.
That direction of policy, at least market as well as many policymakers in the emerging country and developing country need to prepare for this eventuality. I think that's one very important thing. In Indonesia case, back in taper tantrum in 2013, our situation today is much stronger. Back then, our external balance, the balance of payment in a current account deficit, and that's why even when Federal Reserve has not yet moved announcing it, it's already creating a huge jittery. Today, Indonesia, again, because of the war, unfortunately, but then creating this high commodity price, Indonesia has quite a significant commodity which is enjoying this high price. It is not appropriate, morally wrong if I'm saying that we are having the benefit of this situation, but it's our export grew by more than 24% last year, and in this first 3 months it's actually growing even higher than that. So we are enjoying surplus on trade account as well as on my budget. So we are in a position of strong position in which then this kind of situation, hopefully we are going to be much less affected. Although capital outflow is happening already on a bondholder in Indonesia, and in this case, we've already reduced the exposure of the foreign ownership on our bonds to less than 18%. This is significantly reduced than originally 40%. So it creates stability. China situation with the COVID.
Let me stop there and first give her a round of applause for actually speaking real numbers and throwing out some facts, and then even, you know, she she even said it's not morally wrong to say, you know, we've benefited from all this, we've done really well, we've got trade surpluses. She said her central bank balance sheet is in a surplus. So what I'm hearing right now is Indonesia is doing better than everybody at this table. Indonesia is looking real appealing. I don't know what's going on over there, but apparently they got quite a bit of commodities, and with these big price spikes, they've been able to get their debt under control and actually get into a surplus, which is incredible. But not only that, she said that they expect to continue to see growth, and they were seeing outflow of money from their bonds. So other countries were kind of pulling out of their bonds. By reducing the bonds, they owe less money to people. So this is really incredible. And look at her little smile right there. She is looking, I don't know if maybe she's invested in Indonesian stock market or something, or if she's just kind of grinning because she's like, how dare you come up here and speak facts and throw your weight around. That was actually shocking to hear that Indonesia is doing so well beyond everybody else. And let's hear what else she's got to say about this. I'm impressed with her actually getting up there and telling it like it is. So shout out to her. And, you know, that's why she got them purple suede shoes on. She knows what's up. She's out there making money for her country. Her country's making plenty of money. Whether the people are seeing it, I don't know. But apparently Somebody's seeing that money in Indonesia.
And the policy of lockdown definitely create a lot of concern regarding their their growth outlook. Although in this past 2 days we heard from central bank Governor Yi Gang that they are going to do all necessary to make the growth at least still continue strong enough at the level that definitely also create a little bit comfort, but the implication is going to be very deep. I mean, in Indonesia, we implemented this lockdown when we have Delta variant, only 2 weeks, and it really erased the growth on the first quarter last year.
Listen, she's speaking real again. I'm going to run it back. She said they only locked down for the Delta thing for 2 weeks. And that 2 weeks destroyed a bunch of their growth. But only 2 weeks, and they stopped locking down.
Do all necessary to make the growth at least still continue strong enough at the level that definitely also create a little bit comfort, but the implication is going to be very deep. I mean, in Indonesia, we implemented this lockdown when we have Delta variant, only 2 weeks, and it really erased the growth on the first quarter last year to almost to the negative territory. So I can imagine that if you prolong this kind of lockdown, it will definitely have a huge, especially for a city as big as Shanghai in this case. So within that
hold on, what she's writing down. You see her talking about lockdowns are not good. That's exactly what she was saying. And the European leaders over here writing something down in her book. Like, what's she talking about? Look at Jerome Powell's face, though. Look how disgruntled he looks. Here, and then the look of disgust on her face as well. Hearing this Indonesian central bank leader talk. He looks disgruntled and defeated. She looks disgusted, and she is writing down her name and address for the hitman that she... Just kidding.
concern, we are not comparing which one is actually having a bigger impact, but these two very important countries will definitely have a huge impact for many developing and emerging countries. And this is on top of still very difficult recovery for many countries in the world from this pandemic. Although Indonesia output is already surpassing the pre-pandemic level, so we've already 106% above the pre-COVID level. But Indonesia is a few cases. Many is actually struggle, as Kristalina mentioned, they are still under the pre-pandemic level.
Do you have a sense of how much the China lockdowns, especially Shanghai and Shenzhen that we saw, are holding back supply chain even more at this point?
Well, that's definitely, I mean, they are among the biggest port, and for Indonesia, as well as in Asia, I think China demand for many commodities very, very important. So either this is going to be disrupt the supply chains within China, that is have the repercussion for the rest of the world, or in this case have a direct impact in terms of the demand for commodity and other raw material. So that is really a concern.
Prime Minister Motley, haven't forgotten about you. Definitely want to hear from you. I think you win the award for the best growth forecast from the IMF this year, right? 11.2% growth. Tell us what you're experiencing. Obviously, there's a big tourism boom, but you've heard about all these headwinds, and I'm curious how you're affected by it and what you're most focused on.
Yeah, I think that the figures you quoted are what we are hoping for growth for this coming year. But like everywhere else, we are going to have to probably moderate because of the very, very uncertain challenges in the world. And of course, we're not only talking about the war in Ukraine, but we're also talking, as you just referred to the difficulties as a result of the lockdown in China. For us, it is probably the inflation is more of a supply chain problem because excessive demand hasn't really come back as we would like. Our economy fell by about 14% in 2020, as did all other tourism and travel dependent economies in the world in the first year of the pandemic. What we are seeing is literally an increase in inflation. By the end of last year, inflation was regrettably up to almost 6% from just over 2-3% before. So when that is now compounded by the war in Ukraine and the supply chain problems, again with the lockdown in China, we expect to see continued inflationary pressures. And then when you add to that the tightening of monetary policy, that's going to be worse for us because you have to recall that unlike other countries, the only thing we could really do was literally to increase debt. We don't have the benefit of the fiscal and monetary relaxation that Europe and the UK and the US were able to do so successfully in the middle of the pandemic. We don't have those options. And that is why, for us, the whole injustice of the moment probably relates to the fact that the enormous COVID debt that we've accumulated has.
Okay, so why? Okay. There's a lot to analyze. That's why I haven't said anything yet. We can't really see much jewelry other than these two earrings, which just look like probably sterling silver. Could be white gold. It makes sense. This is more of a third world country. Barbados, not a very big country, and a tourist country. I don't know how many cigars she has smoked in her life. Barbados probably has something similar to a Cuban, and I'm imagining she has smoked a lot of those because of that voice. Very interesting voice she has. Ignoring all before. Oh, this is so hard to do. So, the reason why I stopped it there was because she looked down like she was reading off of a script and had to say that word injustices. You can hear the same words, the same vocabulary getting thrown around by several of them. There's injustices, except the Indonesian central bank leader was like, it's not morally wrong for us to say that we're doing really well because of everything going on. You know, so she didn't really say much of that, where we're hearing from the European head and the IMF head, and now her, that same language. Injustices. It's been said quite a bit already throughout here, but let's continue. Grandma. This is somebody's grandma.
Now also to limit the space that we have to be able to fight inflation, because in small economies such as ourselves, small open economies, as you know, the only way we can cushion inflation is by expanding our fiscal position to be able to buffer people. So these things are truly concerning to us. The issue of the debt is even more so. And let us compare, as I have done for the last 2 years, the GSSI and the Common Debt Framework as against what had been done by the G7 countries. And let us also reflect on the fact that we're not going to be serious unless we bring the non-Paris Club actors to the table. The private sector has to come. And we're not going to be serious until we address the issue of the climate crisis and the funding that's necessary, because at the same time that we're facing all of this, we have less than 12 years to adapt to a very, very likability of a 1.5 degree world. But even if it doesn't get there at 1.
This is what I was getting to when I was pointing to that language. Now, we've mentioned climate change, so that's going to start coming up. She mentioned the injustices. She mentioned how the G7 countries, the big countries, which some of them are sitting at that table, the IMF, G7, World Econ Forum, all of these leaders are usually a part of them. And this is sounding a lot like the World Econ Forum's Great Reset.
Two, as you all know, we're already seeing the devastating impacts of the storms and the hurricanes.
Oh, and I forgot, the climate change thing. She said she is really, really worried about a 1.5 degree difference in the world in like 6 years. Earlier today, though, guys, you ain't gonna believe this. It dropped 5 degrees here in Wisconsin in one day. So it's very important, very, very important that even though nobody has any money apparently, except for the oligarchs in charge right now, no countries have any money except for Indonesia apparently. I'm sure China has plenty. But we must somehow muster up more money to fight that 1.5 degree difference in 6 years. It's very important. Very important. It's going to be just a little bit hotter there in Barbados. It's going to be a little bit brighter the next time she gets on screen.
But what most people don't know about are the droughts and the sargassum seaweed and the destruction of the coral reefs that lead to coastal erosion. So at a time when we need to have expenditure more than ever, there is little concessionary funding available, there's little fiscal space available, and there's an urgent need for us to seriously reform the international financial institutions if we are to be equal to the majority of poor people who don't live, by the way, in poor countries. 75% of the poor people of the world live in middle-income countries that are denied access to concessionary funding and that do not have the fiscal space even when they get funded, and that have been compounded by events outside of control in the pandemic and indeed, of course, with the climate crisis.
Okay, so that's something important she pointed out. Most of the world's poor population is in the big countries. It is in the United States. It is in Europe. That is a nice jab, because remember, this is supposed to be a debate so far. It's more like the ladies are all at the spa getting their nails done with Jerome Powell holding all of their pocketbooks. But let's continue.
That sounds like a to-do list for the IMF.
So much so. Mia, I have a piece of really good news for you. You have been championing the allocation of concessional finance, not only.
Now, why were they all laughing at that? They were all laughing like, oh yeah, all the poor people are in our countries. Ha ha. You got us. That's a funny one.
On income per capita, but also on vulnerability to climate shocks. And today at the discussions we had, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which will provide long-term maturity, finally financing to vulnerable middle countries, got a big boost. We signed up already $40 billion for it. So one instrument that you should take pride of when Christine was.
So, I don't know if you caught that. You see, she's sitting here all excited like she's trying to sell us a ShamWow. And she's like, oh, we signed up $40 billion for you little countries. And the head of Barbados there going, wonderful, in a nice, light Samuel L. Jackson-esque voice.
Was the managing director of the IMF. I remember you saying to us, there has to be allocation of concessional finance linked to vulnerability. It has happened. But let me take two more points of Mia's list, if I may. The first one is the issue of debt. In 2020, debt levels have jumped for an understandable reason, to put a floor under the economy, largest increase since the Second World War in 1 year. In 21, it was easy because interest rates were low, access to financing abundant. For some, it was cheaper to pay for more debt in 21 because of this drop in interest rates. 22, different. In 22, we have to brace for quite a number of low-income countries, some middle-income countries, to hit the wall. And we have to be honest. That requires upfront action by the countries themselves. Do all you can. Extend maturities. If you have currency mismatches, fix it. But also for us, and the IMF has its own responsibility, we have to help countries restructure.
She just told them to fix it. She said, if you got problems, fix it.
Structure that early. And if we don't, down the road this year, we may be in a very difficult place. You talked about the 50 basic points. Just imagine what it means for emerging economies if, on top of it, their currency depreciates, which is also possible, and capital starts seeking.
I would say currencies are already depreciating, especially the US's, obviously.
The comfort of coming here to the United States. Very important problem. And the other one I want to touch very briefly on is climate change. It is not going away. On the contrary, it is getting worse. For shock-prone countries, This requires for them to take measures to make their economies less vulnerable to these shocks, for the rest of the world to provide them with the support that is necessary. Sri Mulyani co-chairs the group of finance ministers that are wrestling with this issue. We have to come up with practical, very effective schemes because if we don't...
So what I'm hearing so far from all three of these is that they have nothing. They haven't come up with anything yet, right? They're saying we're going to do things. We're going to use our tools, which is what, Jerome Powell's been saying since all this started. We're going to use our tools to the best of our ability, and here we are at 8.5% inflation with the U.S. dollar devaluing quite a bit, our stock market, the NASDAQ dropping quite a bit today, down almost to 1,300,
It would be, for these countries, for these vulnerable countries, it would be a shock they cannot anymore sustain on their own.
Since we're on the policy discussion, I do want to dive a little bit into monetary policy since we have the world's two leading central bankers at this table. And maybe I'll ask you, MD, who has a tougher job right now? This guy or President Lagarde?
Whoa. Well, they both are fully equipped to do their jobs, and as a result, it is easy for both of them.
Yeah, I think we can agree with that.
But President
Yeah, that's a great joke. It's easy. It's easy for both of them. Let's make jokes about the world poverty right now, and she is enjoying it. We're talking about a joke that she just made about the two world central bank leaders there, the U.S. and Europe, and the terrible policies that they've made so far to this point. And she look at her like she is having a wonderful time. I guess she has to laugh like that because she can't really open her jaw any further with that blue Pokemon that's evolving around her neck. But this is not a laughing matter. This is what you get. This is what happens. More centralization is going to lead to more of this. With these $1 million of diamonds on and all this jewelry and crazy scarves and crazy evil villain laughs. Maybe this lady is the nicest lady in the world in person, but this lady right here, if you're in Europe, is deciding basically how your money works, how your euro works. Is it inflated? Is it not inflated? Same thing with Jerome Powell. You heard Jerome Powell. He's been saying this forever. We want our normal 2% inflation rates. What is the point of a normal 2% inflation rate? If that is the case and they are able to get it back 2%, or if you had a savings account when it was 2%, what was your savings account interest? The top savings account are usually 2% interest. So if we're constantly at a 2% inflation rate and your savings account is at 2% interest, what exactly are you saving? So this nonsense is why we're in this situation, and a lot of blame, of course, is going to COVID. I mean, this is a room full of blame pointing all over the place, except for the Indonesian leader who was basically saying, hey, we're good. I don't know what the rest of y'all are doing, but y'all are screwing up big time. Just look at, come on.
Lagarde, so clear, Europe is dealing with sky-high inflation rates as well, highest we've seen in the Eurozone. Why are you not sounding as hawkish as Chair Powell when it comes to raising interest rates and tackling inflation?
Well, first of all, I'm not a hawk, I'm not a dove, and I'm carrying this little owl with me all the time to remind myself that everything that we eventually decide has to be a concerted, coordinated, collective decision.
I'm not a dove, I'm not a hawk, I'm an owl. So now she's making up her own market terms. She with her little owl pin. She wore this owl pin specifically, but besides that nonsense she just said, I'm gonna run this back. Notice the wording again of what she starts saying.
Raising interest rates and tackling inflation.
Well, first of all, I'm not a hawk, I'm not a dove, and I'm carrying this little owl with me all the time to remind myself that everything that we eventually decide has to be a concerted, coordinated, collective decision.
Collective.
But I think you ask a really important question. And I thank you for that, because it's often the case that commentators, analysts will just put the two of us in the same...
Deflection. She's deflecting right now. The question has been asked. She's still not answered the question. And we're like a minute into this, and she's deflecting to commentators and whatever else that is completely irrelevant to the question.
Bag, and I'm very proud to be associated with Jay Powell, because I respect him greatly. But our economies are moving at a different pace. Our inflation are fed by different components. And as a result of that,
Well, no, your inflation is the same component. You both print money like crazy. So that's the similarity, is you both have used inflation as a tool to suck the money out of the lower and middle classes.
Analysis of the roots and the consequences of inflation have to be different. Let me just give you an example, and I'll just speak for Europe, and then I'll let...
But they are different currencies and a whole lot of different geopolitical things, so they are not the same economies. Therefore, comparing the European economy to the American economy when they don't even use the same currency, it's a hard comparison.
My colleague, Mr. Powell, speak for his economy. Given that we have both the objective of price stability, which is the driving compass for us, our inflation numbers are very high. You're right. 7.4% in March, and we will be, more than double above the target at the end of the year. But when you try to understand what comprises that very high number, you see that almost 50% of it is energy prices. So that's a supply shock that we are taking. If I look at my core inflation, so if you take out food, you take out energy, I'm down to 3%. It is north of my target, which is 2%, but it is more manageable, if I may. It's actually 2%.
What? So she just said if you take out food and energy, the European inflation is fine. They're close to that 2% area. Food and energy are the two most important things. That is your core inflation. There's no other things other than food and energy. If we just cut out the food and energy inflation, hey, inflation will be fine. Just everybody stop buying groceries and stop using energy. Like, what is she talking about?
0.9%, because it's just been revised this morning. So our inflation is fueled by a supply shock, which calls for a particular type of response, which brings together fiscal policies and monetary policy. And obviously, we cannot operate at the same pace, with the same sequence, using the same instrument necessarily when it's that kind of inflation that we are dealing with. So it is much broader based than it was.
That kind of inflation, this term of shock inflation. So again, she's making up new terms. She's an owl, and we went from inflation, deflation, stagflation to now a new shockflation is basically what she's going to say, probably. Or that's going to... I'm going to call it now. We're going to hear shockflation on mainstream media over the next 2 weeks.
It is much higher than our target, but it is supply driven, number one, and it needs to be addressed in a sequential, flexible, gradual way, which is what we have begun doing. We have started the journey back in December. We have reinforced that position in March, and we will have a new set of fresh data in June, which is when we have our next Monetary Policy Governing Council, at which point we will have to determine when we stop net asset purchases in the course of the third quarter, of course, but when in the third quarter? Is it going to be early? Is it going to be later? To be determined by the data that we receive. And that will then lead us to assess whether or not an interest.
Well, I can tell you right now, Europeans, they ain't doing nothing. They basically said they ain't done nothing and they ain't doing nothing. And she said maybe they'll do something in June, depending on the data. So probably not much going to turn around for you guys. Might want to look at Indonesia, see what the housing supply is there.
Hike is needed, and at what point in time after the net asset purchases have concluded.
So you don't have that in your mind, that you'll be raising interest rates, say, in July?
I have all the steps, all the tools, and all the sequences in my mind all the time. And what I look at all the time too is the various indicators that are provided by the forecasters, by market analysts, by markets, by consumers, by the labor market, which informs us, because clearly the second round inflation is one component that for us is critically important in order to determine whether inflation expectations are well re-anchored at around 2% or whether they are at risk of de-anchoring. So that's what I have on my mind all the time. But
they're moving up a little bit, aren't they?
To be fixated on a day, a time in the day, doesn't make any sense to me, because once we say that we are data dependent, for goodness sake, let's wait until we have the data and then we move on to decide. And we've agreed on a sequence. We have to follow that sequence in the journey that we have embarked upon.
What about inflation in the US? Some are wondering if it's peaked.
Yeah, that sounds like a whole bunch of nothing for Europe.
Do you think so?
So let me say one of the great benefits of the IMF meetings is the chance to talk and collaborate, Christine and me. And
deflection. She asked him a direct question, and there he's deflected. Oh, let me just say here that it's great to be here with all the ladies and in my purple tie. I'm glad that Granny Manny was able to make it.
All of our colleagues talk about these things, and we find a couple of things. First is that inflation is really a global problem. It's quite everywhere, and it's high in most places. But there are differences. There are certainly differences. So in the United States, we have very strong growth, and we have higher inflation. We have higher core inflation than Europe does, for example. We also came into this. Europe has struggled more than we have with low inflation, well below target, had a much lower policy rate. So we have a different level of underlying it.
Europe has struggled in the past with lower inflation. We don't struggle with low inflation. We always struggle with high inflation.
So they're just differences. And of course, we all serve domestic mandates. So in the case of the United States, we have had an expectation that inflation would peak around this time and would come down over the course of the rest of the year to an extent, and then come down further in 2023. These expectations have been disappointed in the past, and so now we're really in wanting to see actual progress. It may be that the actual peak was in March, but we don't know that, and so we're not going to.
So, Jerome Powell admitting their expectations were wrong, and then going on to say, well, maybe we should actually try to make some progress. So they weren't ever trying to make progress. First, they were talking about raising interest rates. Then they were talking about raising interest rates. Then they were talking about raising interest rates. And then they were really, really, really considering raising interest rates. And then finally, they raised the interest rates a quarter point and then another quarter point, which is nothing compared to inflation. And now he is acting like, now we've really got to get to work. You should have already got to work when the inflation started. How about not having sustained 2% inflation in the first place?
And we're also no longer going to count on help from supply side healing. We're gonna if we get that, that'll be great, and I think that would be enormous.
Supply side healing. That's what the Fed chair just said of the United States. We were counting on supply side healing. Like some wizard was going to come out of nowhere and give them a potion to the supply. Oh, here's all your supply. Here's a potion. It's all healed. It just healed 2 health or what? Like, what is he talking about?
Mostly helpful in having a soft landing, but we're really going to be raising rates and getting expeditiously to levels that are more neutral and then that are actually tightening policy, if that turns out to be appropriate once we get there.
But isn't it going to be hard to control inflation through tightening when a lot of it is coming from the fact that Russia and Ukraine are major exporters of so many commodities that we need? We don't know how long this war is going to go on. We don't know how long China is going to be seeing these rolling shutdowns and therefore more supply crunch. Isn't it going to be harder than normal to get a handle on inflation through your policies?
Yeah, we of course can't affect supply side issues. We really can't affect much food and energy prices either in the near term. So it comes down to what we can do is our tools work on demand. But we have a job to do on demand, and I'll go point to the labor market. there are, substantially more job openings than there are people who are unemployed. And if
the labor market does not matter if inflation is high. The labor market, everybody is getting paid in the same currency. So getting everybody to work is not going to bring down inflation. The currency printing is the inflation. That is not even in the realm of a tool, first off. Second off, if you're new to the channel, one of the things I constantly preach is there are laws of nature. One of those being supply and demand, and the humans always think that they can control it. And you hear Jerome Powell sitting here pretending like he has some type of control over the natural law of supply and demand. And this is why things get so imbalanced, because human beings with purple ties, blue scarves, are making the decisions for everybody. They believe they are above those laws and can do whatever they want. And as they are seeing, especially Jerome Powell, nothing he's doing is working because they do not have that type of power over natural law. The problems that exist are because of their constant interference into natural supply and demand.
If you take total employed people plus job openings, that's demand for labor. If you look at the size of the labor force, there are more than 5 million more demand than there is supply. So we've got a demand-supply imbalance in the labor market and elsewhere in the economy. It's clear, and that comes from a number of things, including fiscal policy, including what we did at the height of the crisis. So there is a demand job to do, but you're right, we can't fix supply-side problems.
Do you need the stock market to be lower to impact demand?
I never would point to one particular price or asset or class of assets, but generally the way our policy works is we control one overnight rate, plus the balance sheet also has some effects. And that affects broader financial conditions, and that includes asset prices, include credit availability, risk spreads, all kinds of financial conditions. And the financial conditions, in the end, those are what affect the real economy. So we monitor financial conditions. So there really are two steps there. And
wait, he said the real economy. What other economy is there? Is there a fake economy? Like what?
One of the many, there are many different combinations that are possible of financial conditions, and we have seen some tightening from our rate increases, and that's to be expected.
So some people have this idea, President Lagarde, that you guys need to shock the markets to really to start to see more of an impact when it comes to putting pressure on demand and on inflation. Is that something you ascribe to?
I think what we need to do is communicate with as much clarity as possible as to what we analyze, what we see.
She was asking her what they should do. She said we should communicate. So we should talk about it some more. We should just keep talking about everything that's happening. Which is actually probably what they should do. They should just stop everything they're doing. Let the natural laws of supply and demand do their thing and let the markets work themselves out. Just nonsense.
What timing we have in mind and what journey we're embarking on. And for us, it's not so much an issue of tightening when we look at the real rate. It's an issue of normalizing monetary policy. And using the tools that we have. I think the added dimension that Europe has is that it's a monetary union with the complexity of a monetary union where you have 19 different fiscal policies, 19 different treasuries, and that makes my job just a little bit more complicated.
But you also have the euro, which because you're moving at a slower pace is weakening pretty substantially. Is it getting too weak and making the inflation problem worse?
No, we don't target any particular exchange rate. We pay attention to it. It clearly has an impact on inflation, but we don't target any exchange rate.
Minister Miliani, want to move it to the
What?
fiscal side of things. We've done monetary policy. As you look at the appropriate policies right now, it's a little tricky because normally the IMF would advocate for fiscal stimulus in a weakening global economy. Can't do that now when we have such a strong inflationary environment. So how are you thinking of the sort of policies to insulate your economy from some of these issues?
Well, first, we are not starting from the situation which is favorable after 2 years of the pandemic, which is widening the deficit and debt for all countries in the world. That's one thing. Second, with the interest rate inflation and the interest rate response, the cost of borrowing definitely is going to be high. So if you are going to continue boosting, this is the supply demand side in this case. If you look at the recovery in Indonesia case, demand has been now growing very fast. Consumption recover with the mobility because of the pandemic under control, investment recover, export is double-digit growth. So we don't have the recovery from the demand side. If it is going to be a problem, whether this can create overheating, but our
So they don't have a recovery on the demand side. Why is that? Because they are showing surpluses. People in their country are able to afford things and buy things. If the whole entire population has more money, then there will be more demand. And whatever they've been doing apparently is working. That or Indonesia is completely lying. I don't know. But she seems very confident and everybody else seems very disgusted with her reporting. And again, Jerome Powell, where's he looking at? Straight down at the floor. Everybody else looking at her, and he's looking straight down. He will not look at this Indonesian leader. And then there's, for some reason, there's some weird little gas price thing right there. I don't know what that is, but
our inflation is now around 2%. So it's much lower in this case. The problem on the supply side is much more complicated, as Chairman Powell mentioned. If it is related to the energy and food, it politically, socially very sensitive. You cannot delay on that side. And that's why usually that immediately create a fiscal pressure in the form of, are you going to allow this shock coming from outside pass through directly to the people, or you are going to absorb this shock through your fiscal policy by providing subsidy, and then your deficit will be widened. That deficit is going to be too costly because the interest rate now is much higher. So this is really not a free lunch or free policy. You really have to be very careful in designing all aspects of the fiscal side. I think from the Minister of Finance point of view, you should not, just like Christine mentioned, you should not narrow your instrument. You have a lot of options. In a fiscal...
Get him. She is hopping on him right now. She is sitting there spitting facts. Look at her face. Oh my goodness. And that's a stank face right there. It looks like her waiter came by and accidentally scuffed her shoe. That's the type of face that she's making right now. I'm sure she does like that with waiters. But her, it looks like Jerome Powell's finally looking over here, but it really hurts him to look. It looks like he farted and she smelled it. But anyway, I mean, she is giving it to him right now. Let's get back into this.
Fiscal side, you have on revenue side. So on tax, non-tax revenue, excise, you really have to look at the composition of your revenue, which one is actually strong enough to then you can collect more. And that's why in Indonesia, even during pandemic, we reformed the taxation. We passed two legislation, we harmonizing the whole legislation related to the tax, including anticipating to this global taxation agreement, in which we are going to have at least a better arrangement on the taxation across country.
So they did a full-on tax reform when the pandemic hit. We did no such thing. Our taxes have went up. They did a reform. And then she also says the global tax that they've been throwing around, which sounds like is pretty serious the way she said it, like it's already going to happen. They position themselves with their tax reform to give them a better shot with that global tax system. So I'm assuming that means that they lowered their taxes, because notice what she said. You have to look at your revenues. Which one is the strongest revenue that you could tax a little bit heavier and lighten the taxes everywhere else? This is actually decent economic thinking. This is not crazy insanity. This is logical thinking. She's making a lot of sense where everybody else has said absolutely nothing this entire time. She said, hey, Why don't y'all grab your little pieces of papers and pens, bring them out here, and start taking notes, since Indonesia's killing it.
Second one, you look at the spending side, and this is exactly our spending in the past 2 years dominated mainly by the COVID-related spending, health, vaccine, treatment, therapeutic. So now when the declining rate of the COVID, meaning that you have a fiscal space, you don't want to squeeze so that the economy is going to weak again. So the same space, but you free up from this health, you can use it for others. For example, infrastructure again, labor-intensive infrastructure so that you can create job, because many of them is actually unemployed or reduce their income during the pandemic. That can be done. So expenditure side definitely have a room for that, for you to really do in a much more detailed way. What that can create job better, what that can shield this shock. For example, like food security, energy security, infrastructure that can improve your productivity. So that is very important. Then you are dealing with the financing strategy. With this higher borrowing costs, you have to be very careful. So fiscal consolidation is definitely very important. In Indonesia, we're reducing our deficit from 6.1% to 4.5%. We are aiming for 4% and then below 3%. That is the fiscal discipline of the Indonesia fiscal policy in the past 20 years. So we only have 3 years during this pandemic to allow to have the fiscal deficit above 3%. That's signaling to the market that we are on our track, credible enough, so that the market is going to price our bond correctly in this case. So they are not creating excessive punishment only because Chairman Powell said that I'm going to do the 50 basis point how many times. That is going to be something that...
What did he say?
Well, no.
Woo! Woo! She lit Jerome Powell on fire there. He's going to do the 50 basis points how many ever times. So while some of what she is talking is Keynesian economics, investing back into the economy, trying to control the supply and demand, they have lowered taxes and they're focused on decreasing their overall debt. Then saying you will be able to get real value from our bonds and yields because we're not printing a ton of money and doing all this shenanigans like Jerome Powell just said. We're doing common sense, logical options. You know, if you are going to invest back in the economy, at least make sure the investment is where it needs to be, like she said, on food and energy. If that is your big inflation problem, well then focus all of your investments from taxes into that problem. We do not do that. We sent money everywhere else around the world. Everybody's been sending money, and I'm talking about individual level to the top level, sending tons of money to Ukraine at a time where we can't afford to send any money. So, I mean, she's just laying it out on the table for them that you guys all suck at what you're doing. And if you just had some fiscal discipline. Now, that word hasn't been thrown around whatsoever in this meeting. And that's not a word that's thrown around whatsoever with the Great Reset. So, I like that. Fiscal discipline. Shout out to Indonesia. I may be moving there.
Prime Minister Motley, you brought up food insecurity in your very powerful, I went back last night and watched it again, inspiring speech at the UN last fall, I believe. That was before any of this got so extreme because of the war in Russia. So I'm curious how you're thinking about it now and what sort of solutions we can look at.
Well, the truth is that all of us have had to go into a situation where we've put measures in place to boost food security, food and nutritional security. In the Caribbean community, we've set a target, which was there before all of this, of reducing imports by 25% by 2025. And we have an agricultural investment conference coming up in Guyana, which is the lead country on food security for us in the Caribbean community. But I make the point because I heard my colleague Minister just now referring to what has to be done in order to protect our people against these pressures. The reality is that with a high debt framework, as most of our developing countries have, as small island developing states, not because of profligacy, not because of corruption, but largely because of having to take on our balance sheets the consequences of the actions of others. We feel that the time has now come for us to make some decisions to change it. And Kristalina, you're absolutely correct about the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, and we thank you for it. And in fact, it's a right step in the right direction. It's the only step thus far that acknowledges vulnerability, but we need the World Bank and the development banks to go further with us. And the reality, one of the things you said to us at the beginning of the pandemic was that you needed us to to spend the money but keep the receipts. And we did in fact keep the receipts. So it should be easy to identify COVID specific debt. It should even be easy to identify climate related debt. But what we need to do, because of our highly indebted situation already, is to put this on another international.
So she is saying you told us to save all our receipts for the spending we did during this and you were going to help us out. Well, what I'm hearing is we listened to you, which that's your fault for listening to Jerome Powell, the head of the European. You're your own country. You don't have to listen to what they say. Take El Salvador, for example, who's switched their currency to Bitcoin. You don't got to listen to the feds. You don't got to listen to the central banks. It's your own country. Do what you want. You listen to them tell you to spend all this money, and now you're mad because they don't have any money to pay you back for the spending that you did. You're going to put your whole population of the Caribbean area at risk. You know, if that's what you're going to bank it on somebody's words high up. And she also said it's not because of corruption or anything like that, which is absolutely nonsense. This right here going on, this whole meeting is a whole meeting of corruption. It's just funny. It's almost like the Legion of Doom going on here. But no, I mean, I feel for the people in those countries, but she put them in that position.
National balance sheet. You can perhaps have a pandemic trust and you can have a climate adaptation trust. But the reality is that what we need is to be able to move it off of our balance sheet, because if it is on our balance sheet, then it precludes us from being able to achieve the SDGs, which is our normal development trajectory. And we really want you to perhaps.
So, yeah, you hear that? It's on our balance sheets. We need to get it off so we can grow. You know, we spend all this money. It's on our balance sheet, but this needs to be on your balance sheet. You need to take it. You take it.
Treat it like the British war debt, if it has to come on our balance sheet. Because if it's coming on our balance sheet, how do you have a situation where the British understood after World War One, they issued bonds in 1914 and 1917 as 30-year debt at 5%, consolidated them in 1932 to 3.5% with no maturity, and it became perpetual debt that they paid off 100 years after the 1914 debt. Now we have to think outside of the box, because it's becoming increasingly difficult even for us to shield our populations with the limited fiscal space that we have against the fact that the cost of debt is likely to increase because of the monetary conditions tightening, and because of the fact that we just simply are not seeing the rate of economic recovery as quickly as we need to. Now, we're confident that tourism recovery usually can come back and bounce back quicker than most, but what is happening with the increased fuel costs will affect the cost of flights, will affect also how people view where they want to go. And you have to ask yourself, and Christine, you're perhaps better in a position to say this, is there still a strong appetite for travel in Europe, given what is happening with the war in Ukraine? And I just hope that we can take the bold and brave decisions necessary, because too many people's lives are at stake. And quite frankly, it cannot be a unidimensional conversation either about what is happening in Ukraine alone. We are totally sympathetic. But what's happening to the people in Tigray? What's happening to the people in Yemen? What's happening to the people elsewhere that are all.
That last little bit was actually some pretty legitimate concerns where oil prices so high because they are islands. It is going to cost a lot for those freight ships to bring products there. All their imports and exports are going to cost even more. So I'd imagine the prices on these islands right now for basic food, stuff like that, are really, really high. And if oil doesn't keep coming down, they're going to have problems.
Also on the verge of a humanitarian crisis, if not in the midst of that crisis already.
There's a lot there. A few questions? I think you can.
I think Mia is totally right, and I think that we should acknowledge that all wars are horrible, are human tragedy, are causing devastation and economic harm. All wars, and this one is no different, and it is self-inflicted by Russia in a determined and totally unjustifiable way. But all wars are to be stopped. You're completely right. And consequences of war, when you look at Afghanistan, for instance, that's another place where clearly the consequences of wars and years of wars are hurting people and hurting women more than anything else, actually.
Wait, that was something to specify. Oh, I guess it's Afghanistan. If it's ran by a regime that doesn't give women rights and stuff, those women specifically would be getting hurt, if that's what she meant by that. I'm assuming that's what she meant by that. But just if she was just throwing that out there, like women are being hurt more than men across the globe at the moment financially, that's a weird statement to make in the first place, because everybody is getting destroyed there. So not really sure.
Respond to on the debt question.
When the IMF was created, the main objective was to help countries correct domestic policies that are undermining their opportunities to grow and create employment. Today, what Mia is saying is we live in a world in which there are exogenous shocks that are harming countries and are putting them in a position in which on their own they simply cannot handle it. And the question in front of us is, how do we recognize that it is not bad governance, it is not bad policies, it is a climate shock, a pandemic, a war?
Oh, how do we realize that it's not bad policies, it's not bad governance that has caused all the problems? It's everything else. It's everything else that's the problem, not us. We're here to help. We're trying to help. Remember, we signed on for $40 billion for all you small countries, the tons and tons of small countries that are out there that $40 billion isn't going to do anything with, especially because $40 billion right now is at 8.5% inflation with the higher prices because of everything going on. So that was a slap in the face, that original $40 billion comment. But then now she's even going further to say, none of this is bad policies. None of this is our fault. This is all shock. Remember, shock is constantly coming up as a word.
That is dramatically impacting a country. And what is the role of international institutions to be a corrective force in that regard? During our meetings this time, this issue of what is the role of the IMF in a world of multiple shocks, some of which are because of the evil of man, some of which are because of Mother Nature.
The evils of men? Instead of blaming government policies, she's blaming it on men now. That's where we're going with this? The evils of men? Okay. Oh, man. No wonder Jerome Powell's so uncomfortable. He's the piñata. He's up there as a punching bag for everybody.
But they are devastating countries to a point in which they simply cannot pull themselves out. This is one issue, and Mia is right, we have to work on identifying instruments. We are looking into are debt for climate swaps a possibility? We haven't advanced it enough. It is still in the universe of retail. In other words, I would do it for you, for your project. We want to move it to performance indicators and the world of wholesale. In other words, we do programs with a country like Barbados. The second issue, though, is that not all problems are exogenous. We still have plenty of problems that come because of poor judgment, bad governance, corruption. When Christine was the managing director here in 2018,
Interesting. Look at the look on her face. Now she goes, after saying all that, she says there is some corruption and some bad governments, and then says, Christine, hey, head of the European Bank, when you were in charge. And you see this look on her face of concern about what you about to say.
early 2019, in these good days that we almost forgot existed, she would say, when the sun is shining, fix the roof. Mm-hmm. What we are now discovering is that many countries did not fix the roof when the sun is shining. Now it is pouring. Well, maybe now we get to fixing the roof. I would strongly argue that there are many countries where structural reforms related to transparency, improvements in governance, can significantly improve image, attractiveness for private investments and performance. Indonesia has done systematic reforms that took Indonesia now to be in the small universe of countries.
Systematic. No, not I mean, you want to throw the systematic word around if you want, but they did a tax reform. Why don't you specify that instead of saying systematic reform? There's a difference in that wording. Everybody knows what who uses systematic as a hot word all the time.
Emerging market countries that have caught up with their pre-pandemic level. And I think for us, we should not shy away from the issue of good policies mean better lives of people.
You mentioned the role of the IMF. You know, there is this bigger question right now about the role of globalization in general and the onshoring of manufacturing and supply chain. And it started with COVID, or maybe even before that, and really got exacerbated by this war in Ukraine. And obviously, Chair Powell, there are going to be ramifications of this for growth and for inflation if we are, in fact, in a world where globalization is going in reverse or even dying. What do you think?
Well, that is certainly a possible outcome here. I think you've seen questions about globalization, and this series of events around Ukraine certainly has the possibility of leading to a more fragmented political situation and economic situation. You saw Secretary Yellen's speech this week about looking to, I think she called it friendshoring. So I think there's a lot of thinking going on like that. You know, the globalization that we had benefits to it, and it had cost involved in it. And you know, these are really questions more for elected governments, I would say, than they are for a central bank. But there would certainly be a different world. It might be a world of perhaps higher inflation, perhaps lower productivity, but more resilient, more robust supply chains. If we were to have, I mean, the supply chains that we had were very efficient, but quite fragile, it turned out. So. And I think it's not clear that we're seeing a reversal of globalization. It is clear, I think, that it's certainly slowed down, and it may go into reverse. I don't know.
Is that? I mean, clearly Europe's thinking about it in terms of security and things like energy and dependence on that sort of thing. Do you think we're going in reverse?
No, I think we are going to revisit the terms of trade and who we are trading with, and on what principles we are determined to continue trading. And reorganizing supply chains. And, you know, for once, I'm quite happy to actually plead for the case of Europe, because there's always Europe bashing now and again. And I think that the work that we had to do over the last 70 years and the adjustment that we had to make, moving from a small group of 6 to now 27 countries, which are all members of this, you know, single market, where goods, capital, and people move freely, has been a laboratory of a different kind of trade. And it is not easy, let's face it. There are countries sometimes that are drifting, that would like to operate slightly differently, but where the governance, the rule of law, the principles by which we abide when we join the club, keep us together and keep up on track with those key principles that we respect. So it is a bit of a laboratory, and I would hope that as we re-examine and revisit globalization, which has provided a lot of good in and of itself, we can use that experience to see how we can enforce, how we can govern, how we can make sure that everybody is included, that we don't leave some by the side of the road, but we try to be together and make sure that it is inclusive.
I know it's something you're thinking about a lot. I mean,
Yes,
maybe it's a
of course.
taboo topic to talk about in an IMF World Bank meeting, but this idea of the fragmentation, of what's happening geopolitically and the alliances that are forming and how that's going to drive the underlying.
So we're getting this whole narrative that globalization is not actually happening. Jerome Powell saying there is some defragmentation, but he doesn't think, again, he's in the middle, he don't know. She's saying that we should revisit globalization and that they have everything going good in the European nation, which if that was the case, they wouldn't be talking about all the stuff that's going on in the first place. So obviously what they've been doing is not working, and that's probably why they get Europe bashing from now and again.
We are living in a multipolar world, and that has already led to some frictions and some shifts in trading partners. But I am in the boat of those who say we are so integrated, and if you make a list of the problems that no one country can resolve on its own, it's a very long list. We have to find ways to work together. So what is the question? Are we going to evolve in blocks that are closed and function independently from each other? Or
Yes,
we would
please.
have some preferences, preferred trading partners, but we will have highways and bridges that allow us to still solve big problems, come on the same page. What was so interesting today in our discussions was how strong the voice of we have to work together was in the room. And it was especially emerging markets and developing economies.
Now you hear that question was phrased like, oh, is globalization falling apart? Like this is a bad thing that globalization is falling apart. And they've all said their little piece, and now she's coming in, wrapping it all together. The strong message here today is that we need to work together. We need to do this.
That said, hey, we have achieved so much because of this integrated global economy. It is irresponsible to make the world poorer. And actually, Sri Mulyani spoke so well that it is the quality of our world, not just the quality of our economies, that is at stake. But it is more difficult, and it makes my job even more important in finding place for all of us.
Oh, you hear that? Oh, my job is now even more important. Earlier, she was saying, my job is more complicated. These people, she's got on pearl necklaces, and of course, old Quella de Vil over here with all her diamonds, acting like they have the hardest jobs in the world. I don't want to hear how hard your job is. Your job is not that hard. Y'all just overcomplicate things to fit your narratives and all this nonsense. And that's why your job is hard. It's self-inflicted. So I don't want to sit up here. I don't want to sit here and hear y'all whine and cry in your $1 million of diamonds and nice pearl necklaces.
You probably have heard the story of communiques not materializing. Didn't materialize for us at the IMFC, but if everybody agreed on the substance of the policy conclusions and recommendations, everybody. And then we had one member that said, well, but you're saying something else there that I don't agree with. Mm-hmm. It is very, very early, in my view, to go and buy.
So there's a problem that another country disagreed with their policy. Everybody agreed except for this one person, and that's a problem. Wonder who that one person was. Wonder if we'll find out.
A coffin for globalization. Not that yet.
That's quite a statement. Minister Mulyani, curious about your take and whether you find yourself in sort of an awkward position because of the close trade ties with China and proximity there, and then obviously the relationship with the U.S. and also as the chair of G20 in the developing nations there, how you sort of weave all of this together.
Well, all emerging country, developing country, or from developing country to become emerging country, they usually can achieve those level of progress because they were open. They are also integrated with the global economy.
Yeah.
So when Christine was in the IMF, I think telling about the globalization has reduced a lot of poverty, and that's why what we are aiming, or the focus for many countries, is how you are going to prepare the foundation of your economy, whether this is on a policy level, institutional level, as well as the practice of the business that need to be competitive, so that you are going to be able to have this efficiency, productivity, and then improvement on the livelihood of the people. Now it's changed. The language is no longer about efficiency, but all on security, talking about reliability. So even I think we just heard from Chairman Powell that if that is at the cost of efficiency, be it maybe. Now, that's really maybe creating a huge impact for many developing country, emerging country, who they, in this case, enjoying this improvement as well as the progress in their economy and prosperity through globalization, through trade and investment. And this is no longer become the instrument. Now for Indonesia, because we are big enough country, the biggest in the ASEAN economy, and of course in terms of the trade partner, investment partner, United States, European, Japan, and China, they are all the biggest partner for Indonesia, of course. Within the ASEAN, we have, for example, with Singapore. So the choices is there. And we enjoy this because we know that the world following and implementing the global rule, even though it's not perfect. If you talk about WTO, there is here and there, but we know that there is a rule as a baseline in which we will play based on that. And that's exactly what holding all of us, the world together.
Yeah.
Now, if a country can violating international rules.
So she was asked what her take was on the globalization, and she says, well, we've positioned ourselves for that to be, a possibility. If that does happen, we're good, but we're good either way. So she's saying whatever y'all decide to do with that doesn't matter to us because we're good. So y'all decide what you want to do.
Or in this case that we no longer trust this rule can secure or providing safety and security and certainty, then the world is actually resetting. It's totally different. And this is historical in a way, because the world enjoying huge progress in terms of prosperity. If you look at declining of the poverty rate, improvement in the human capital index, infrastructure development, they are all because we rely on this goodwill, trust, and building this rule for all countries in which then we can rely. I'm not saying it was proper. It is not.
No, it is not.
There is always like, but it served well, or at least it served all the member countries in this world to actually rely on those kind of mechanism. Now, I think it's shaky. And that is exactly maybe what is the highest risk for any country to design their own policy. What does it mean for Indonesia? Should we like self-sufficient in this case? For Indonesia, it could be, because we are big, we have a lot of land, we have fertile land. So we do have like the food security, energy security, we have coal, we have oil, we have gas. But not all countries have this kind of luxury like us. And so should we not care about others? That is not really, I think, the right, morally not right, as well as from the interests of the global economy, it is not also right.
We're tight on time. We have 1 minute left, but I do want to hear really quickly from everyone, including you, Prime Minister Motley. I sometimes get the best answers as a journalist when I ask people what we're not paying attention to, what the media or the world is not focused on. So I'll ask you just very quickly, either an upside risk or a downside risk as it relates to the global economy, what we're not paying close enough attention to, and what you would flag. And Prime Minister Motley, put you on the spot and go to you first.
I'm saying that there's an absence of global coordinated political leadership. The G20 is not representative enough. and we don't have the political will. The problem is not with the people who you have in the studio for the most part. It's not the heads of the institutions. It's the absence of countries to act in a coordinated way that will relieve the pressure. We saw it in the pandemic. We're seeing it with too many other issues, and hopefully we can get the sense of urgency of the moment impressed on all of us globally, such that we can avert the worst.
So, can we get the sense of emergency pressed on all of us? Interesting.
And Mr. Miliani, what about you?
Well, I think as holding this presidency of G20, what is remarkable given this tension, all countries that we consulted, because G20 is based on the consensus, all countries that we consulted, they believe and they also want that the cooperation and collaboration and coordination, what Prime Minister Maya mentioned, is actually the one that they want this to be preserved, regardless differences. So amazingly, what we are thinking it's supposed to be safe and preserved, and with the reality that we are now facing is actually quite a big gap. So our responsibility holding this presidency is try to continue making this goodwill of collaboration and cooperation. Try to save a piece of the world's most important asset, that is coordination and collaboration.
Will Putin be at G20 in Bali this year?
Well, we invited because inviting the head of state cannot be like, oh, tomorrow we are going to have a G20 and then they just send. We invited back then, and it's already now all the country in the G20 received the invitation. In terms of the arrangement of the meeting itself, just like what we have yesterday, it was not easy, but at the end they are all in the same room. But if you don't agree and you want to express this politically, like Christine, he walked out. So that's another expression of the politics. But it doesn't prevent us to talk about.
Oh, so it was Putin. It was Putin that she was talking about earlier that doesn't agree with the globalization and everything and walked out of the room. Oh, the old Indonesian lady who's been spitting the facts. Let the facts slip there. Interesting.
About the substance which is important, not only serving the G20 but also for the rest of the world. So it should be manageable and doable.
Chair Powell, what are we not paying enough attention to?
So I'll tell you what I'm thinking about, which is, we had this economy that was, very low inflation, very low unemployment everywhere in the world before the pandemic. Then the pandemic comes in and really knocks everything sideways. Then we have this remarkable, particularly in the United States, response. Incredibly fast recovery, faster than anyone hoped. And then we have inflation. And so that's a lot right there. And then we have a war, and now we're realizing that COVID is still really with us. So
now it's back to COVID again. We got this and we got that. We got all these stuff. Listen, it's crazy out here. We got a lot of things going on that we got to wear purple ties for. We're not going to be in a good spot.
But what I'm thinking about is a couple things. One is, how is this? Are we going back? Probably not, to the old economy. What's the new one going to look like? The other thing, maybe more pertinent to your question, is in the middle of this is a labor market in the United States where people can get paid well. It's too hot, it's unsustainably hot, but notwithstanding that, it's a very, very good labor market.
You can get paid very well right now in U.S. dollars that are inflated at 8.5%. That's really nice. Come to the United States. Work for some of our inflated money.
Market for workers, and it's our job to get it into a better place where supply and demand are closer together. But I'd say that's how I'd respond.
In the upside category, risk, you're saying wages are good, people can get jobs.
I think there's a lot to like about the U.S. labor market, but I'd be the first to say, though, that it's not sustainably hot. But I do think with our tools, we can get supply and demand better aligned.
President Lagarde, what about you? What should we be paying more attention to?
I think of two things. One is what I would call the green swan. We talk about black swans, and I agree with Jay that we've had one thing after the other hitting us. And
all right. So that's where I'm going to end this at, because now she's made up a third new economic term, a green swan. This is the problem. When people get too much power, they feel like they have the ability to start making things up. And she has made up three different terms financially, economically, that have not existed. Why does she get to make up financial terms? Because she's wearing all these diamonds? Or because of whatever reason she's gotten where she's gotten that got her these diamonds, or whoever's family she's a part of, or whatever. But obviously this whole thing was a stage somewhat, for the most part. I think the Indonesian leader, central bank leader, I would like to do more research on and their economy and what they actually are doing to see if she's actually telling the truth, because there was a lot of facts she was spitting about economics and how to handle certain things, especially in these markets. I mean, she was straight up giving everybody else the business. However, if this was all staged, maybe it was, maybe it's not, it definitely looks like there is some staging to it in a way, and it was supposed to be a debate. Really wasn't much debate, just a lot of finger pointing and blaming, and the Indonesian lady just sitting there chilling. So if it was all staged, it was obviously staged. If it wasn't staged, it was tried to somewhat be staged to push a certain narrative, and I don't think that narrative got out the way they wanted it to, as most of these leaders were pushing for globalization, Great Reset type of stuff, and then you hear Indonesia saying, hey, we don't want a part of that, and then very interesting that the person who doesn't agree with all the globalization is Putin. And that's the person that they keep on saying the injustices. We have to, she was very excited and happy about what they did to the Russian people. Now, I'm not justifying anything for Putin or defending Putin. All I'm saying is there is obviously something more going on between these world leaders, and we're even seeing them admit that there is defragmentation. So to me, that's a good sign, because I don't want the Great Reset. If you read about the Great Reset in the World Econ Forum, by 2030 you will own nothing and be happy. That does not sound good to me. I will own whatever I own, and y'all will be sad. That's what I say back to them. If this is true and we are seeing this defragmentation, good, because we need to stop trying to save everybody. We need to focus on our own countries and fix them first, as the Indonesian leader was saying. Why are we focusing on everything else when we should focus on our own policies? They did a whole entire tax reform. I don't think it would be that difficult for the U.S. to do a tax reform, and it is definitely needed. But as she clearly pointed out and made fun of, continuing to print money, continuing to raise interest rates barely during inflation, and all this little nonsense that Europe and Jerome Powell's doing in the U.S. it's nonsense. I mean, she's blatantly straight calling them out on it. So there's things that need to happen. Whether these leaders are going to do the right things or wrong things, who knows? All I know is in America, it's not looking good. But with the defragmentation, in comes the full-on decentralization that I'm excited about of blockchain technology. We can all still sell products together and trade products across the world, and we can do it easier, more efficient, less energy with cryptocurrency. And we don't have to all be under the same global rule. We can have our own governance, just like the Indonesian lady was talking about. So, biggest highlight of this whole thing is Indonesia at least is putting on one good act, or Indonesia is really killing it. Either way, may be an interesting place to look at for future housing, investments, stock market, all of that stuff. I am curious to find out, too, what Indonesia's outlook is on cryptocurrencies, and if they are in the boat for adopting them, as they do sound like that's something they may look at with their more individual country focusing on their own country instead of everything else. And I think if everybody did that, if every country just focused on their own stuff and leave to everybody else alone. Well, if every country did what Indonesia did, then every single country would be better. It starts from the small seed and grows. You don't put a whole entire tree in the ground that's 20 foot tall. No, you start with a seed. And that is very good economic policy, at least from what she was saying. The rest of all this, take what you want from it. Take what you want from whatever I said, but do your own research as always. I am not a financial advisor or any of that. I'm just here to point out things and also make fun of these ridiculous scarves. My God, what a scarf. Appreciate everybody joining me as always. Stay safe out there. Until next time.
This is war with the enemy. Think that it was meant to be. Living in a time where disease is on every screen. I won't let them fester me. I know most are festering. Negativity is a plague for the mentally.